Welcome to the Vision for Life podcast, an ongoing conversation between the pastors of Fellowship Denver and the church at large. Each week, we talk about life, faith, the Bible, and how to follow Jesus as we go about our daily lives. I'm Autumn, host of the podcast, and today, Dave Moreland and Michael Goldstein, two of my friends and co-workers, are joining me on the podcast. Guys, thanks for being with me.
Thanks for having us.
Yup.
That was Michael.
Sorry, this is Michael. I'm actually just here to be a fly on the wall and to listen to these two brilliant minds. So, and I'm a great listener. Everybody says this about me.
Yeah. Michael's contending that Dave and I are professional podcasters.
They are. They both host a podcast as part of their jobs, which is their profession. So you are both professional podcasters, and I am not.
I don't think we've never been paid to do podcasting.
That's fair, but what does your LinkedIn profile say?
I don't have
Because it should
LinkedIn.
say, okay, well, that makes sense.
It definitely doesn't say that. I don't actually even know. I do have a LinkedIn profile. I don't know what it says. I haven't looked at it or updated it in a while.
Nice.
Well, thanks for being here, Michael. We'll see how that pans out. Hopefully you end up talking some today and not just listening.
I'll do my
You are
best.
bashful, but we'll try to draw you out.
I'll
of
do
your
my
shell.
best.
Well, I asked both of you here today to have this conversation with me because we're talking about parenting and discipleship at home and spiritual formation and establishing healthy rhythms within our family life at home. And you both are parents. So
You clearly need to establish some rhythms.
That was the qualification for this podcast, to be a parent. Well, also, back to the fact that I'm not a professional podcaster. You guys are also way more experienced at this than me, having 18 and a 15-year-old. That gives you at least over 10 years, 14 years experience on this than me. So strike two for me on this one.
I really don't see that actually as a downside in this
Okay.
conversation. That
Okay.
was one actually real plus in asking you to join us in the conversation today, Michael, because I think the stage of life that you're in is representative of where so many of our families who are a part of our Fellowship Denver family, that's the stage of life they're in too. They have littler kids. The rhythms that you're probably asking about and establishing look a little bit different than what Dave and Renee are doing in their home. So actually, that's where we're going to start our conversation today is just, I was going to ask both of you to explain your family makeup, the age of your kids, what stage of life you are in, and then also within that, what's a particular joy that you're experiencing as you consider the age of your kids right now, and a difficulty that is specific to having children of that age.
So Renee and I, we have been married for 22 years. We have three boys, Will, who's 18, Ian, who's 16, and Beckett, who's 13. So all officially teenagers now. And
Bless you.
I would say every stage has had unique joy to it, for sure. But this stage, the joy is in the level of connection I'm able to foster with each kid. Because they're older, they've gone through stuff. When we hang out, we can. It's not like we're best friends in that sense, but it has more friendship dynamics than it had, in previous stages of parenting. So whether it's Will talking about college and sort of preparing him for life outside of our home, or Ian thinking about kind of what's next, for me as he moves into his last couple of years in high school, and Beckett as he's dealing with middle school. Like, the conversations are a little bit deeper. They're a little bit, I would say, easier to have from my perspective than when they were younger. It takes less effort to connect with them than it did when they were just younger. So that's a sweet season for me right now.
My stage of life, me and my wife Jillian have been married for 8 years, going on 9. I think I'm right on that. And that's going to get into what's difficult about having young kids is memory. And no, we're 8 years going on 9. And we have 2 daughters, a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old. And we have a third on the way. Jillian's due at the end of August. So we're very much entrenched in the young kids at home phase. And the joy of it is they're so fun. And they're so cute. My girls are so cute. And especially Clementine right now is 2. We like to call her like she's a little cartoon character. And if you've ever seen her at church, everybody knows this about her. Her big reactions, her laugh. I mean, she does this thing right now where if we say like, hey, we're going to go somewhere she wants to go and see someone, a friend, or we're going to watch a movie, she goes, yay, yay, hooray, hooray. It's like the cutest thing in the world, right? And so everything is just really fun. And then with Rosie, as a 4-year-old, she's just getting into that phase where it's like this real personality is coming out. You can really have conversations with her. We can snuggle and talk, and we can start to do things together. We've been going on a weekly date, just the 2 of us. We go to a coffee shop and sit, and it's not just me telling her to stop doing things. You know, it's like, it's really fun and sweet. And I've tried not to forecast too much in the future of like wishing my kids were older so I could do more with them, because I think that's a temptation. But it is fun now that they're getting older. We can do more stuff. So the difficulty is, I mean, do I need to explain the difficulty of having a 4 and a 2-year-old, 2 toddlers at home? Okay. Is that like, or I feel like it's like somewhat self-explanatory.
I will say families who have older kids, it's remarkable how you forget.
Yeah.
Like it's
I'm already forgetting like the baby
crazy.
thing.
It really is crazy how easy it is to forget how like just that rhythm of having a little kid. So
that's it. It's physically taxing. It's not, I'll let you guys talk more about the teenage world, but I work with teenagers too. I understand it's emotionally difficult. It's physically challenging to have young children at home. We're very tired all the time. They need constant attention. We're always on our feet. We don't get nearly as much sleep as the human body desires and needs. And so, and then they're completely unpredictable. And so, like I said, Clementine is the cutest kid in the entire world. She's big emotionally. And so when the highs are really high with her and the lows are like so low with her, and I feel really helpless as a parent when she's in the low phase, tantrum out of control. And it can really wear on us. Like we can be at the end of the day of like, that was just so exhausting. And so I don't say that to say it takes away from the joy, but that is the premier challenge of our stage of life right now is just the physical exhaustion.
Dave, how about in this stage of life when you have all teenagers, are there any difficulties that are specific to having kids of this age?
I feel like the mistakes kids can make as teenagers can have more lasting impact. So it feels more like you're playing for keeps. Now, I know when you have toddlers, like you're trying to protect them from themselves in a very real sense. And so it's stressful in that way. But I would say knowing that, like, for example, Will has an interview coming up, and based on how he does on this interview could potentially impact the next 4 years of his life in one interview. That's a ton of, like, it's very weighty. And Ian is now realizing, hey, what the grade that I get in this course that's really hard, it's kind of stuck with me for the next foreseeable future. So it feels like you're just playing for keeps more. And it now I think they have more experience and wisdom to handle it, but it's also weightier and it's hard to navigate sometimes how much to lean into that weight and how much to say, hey, it's not that important. It's, you're still just a kid. Like it's sometimes hard to discern when to press the pedal down and when to kind of tap the brakes and say, hey, let's just cool off a little bit.
In my family, I'm kind of in between as far as just the parenting stage. My oldest just turned 16, and my youngest is about to turn 7. They're 9 years apart. And so I'm in between, where Michael and Jillian with little kids, not quite in the little kids stage anymore, and not quite to the stage where I have one heading off to college, Dave, but there's some overlap there. But that's my kids are, so my oldest I said is 16 and my youngest is 7. Then I have one who's 12. So we're right in that, just they're all in school, one in elementary, one in middle school, one in high school, which has its own unique set of challenges.
That's incredible. I'm just like, I think that is amazing.
But while each stage has its own, I think, joys and challenges, we also, in every stage of parenting, at least this has been true in my family, and I think from our conversations outside of this podcast, this has been true for you too. You have these moments where you realize that there's a pattern that has developed in your life as a family that's become maybe a habit or something that feels like a default, like a way you exist together. And so you start to realize that this is a pattern or a habit, but not one that you've chosen. It's just something that has sort of happened. Maybe you can't even remember why or when that happened. And we've used a term for this before in some of our podcasts, definitely in classes that we teach here at Fellowship, and that is a liturgy. So just something that we repeat often. It might be on a daily basis or a weekly basis. And we call them cultural liturgies. And often when these develop or grow up in our house, it's not because it's something that we did intentionally. It's because it's just something that we sort of happened into or feel like was enforced upon us. So I wonder if both of you could share if you've had one of these moments, what it was, what you realized this pattern had become in your household, or maybe that's something you're processing right now. But what might be an example of those?
The one that immediately comes to mind that kind of served as sort of a paradigm shift for us when we began to sort of mess with it was we kind of have this inherited kind of tradition that in the evenings we're going to have family dinner together, which when you have tiny kids, they're awful. They're terrible.
It's the worst hour of the day.
It's really hard.
10 minutes.
Yeah, no, it's terrible. Like the time when you would expect them to sit down and to have meaningful conversation, it's not a reasonable thing to expect a 2-year-old or 4-year-old or whatever to be able to do that and for it to be a good experience. Nevertheless, that's kind of a cultural expectation that we had. And I remember at some point, again, several years ago, we kind of gave ourselves freedom to think, what if breakfast can kind of serve in that space of time of connection and kind of shift our expectation to where, okay, the most important thing is connection, family time together, talking about stuff. But let's do it when our kids have behaviorally, it feels reasonable for them to do it. And we're not expecting to do something that is setting us up, ourselves and them up for failure inevitably, systemically every evening. So we kind of began to prioritize breakfast in a certain season in our life. Didn't have the expectation that dinner was going to be this production. Now, I will say, as the years have progressed, we do now have dinner. And it is more of what I've had kind of hoped it would be initially. But really, it's the value that stayed the same. Having a time every day, you connect the kids, talk about what's going on. That's still happening, but the pattern, the actual habit of when it's happening, and then you have to structure your life around that habit so that it actually works and make sure that it's rooted in a real value. You have to do all that work. But that shifted, but the values remained the same.
Autumn kind of reminded me of this as we were talking before this podcast. And if you have young children, you're listening to this, you'll know exactly what I mean. But when you have little kids, you're constantly living in the tension of what you know is right and what you know works. and so you're like, you know, and a lot of this will revolve around shows. A lot like
Yes.
a show makes everything with a young kid easier. Going like brushing your teeth when you're sad, when you don't want to eat. You just always have the option when you need an hour of peace and quiet. And as parents come to realize, when you build in those rewards, or if you start doing what works, then the expectation comes of that. So like we're doing bedtime. Well, we always do 2 books. Then they start saying, well, I want another book. And you're like, I'm not going to do another book. And the question is, do I want to fight for an hour right now when I'm exhausted? Or do I just want to read them another book? I'm just going to read them another book. Well, guess what? Now you're on the hook for the next 7 years to read 3 books.
Yep.
And maybe 4. And where does it end? And so you're just constantly living in this tension of like, do I set the terms for this, or do they set the terms with this? What's going to actually get this done? Dinner time, for example. If you take 3 bites, you can have dessert. Well, guess what? Now I have to do dessert every single meal, which I know is not good for them. So also, like, if you're a parent, you get into a rhythm with shows. I don't want you to feel guilty about that. A lot of parents feel a ton of guilt over that. I get it.
Yeah.
I get it. It's the only way to get your kids to sit still and be quiet.
I gave this silly example. This is what you're referencing, Michael, that years ago. So my youngest, Ivy, she has long hair. It's pretty fine. It gets tangly pretty easily. And so in order to just make it through brushing her hair out, I let her watch a show on my phone or the tablet. And now that is the expectation in Ivy's mind. Those 2 things are inextricably linked together. Brushing hair means you get to watch something.
Right. And this started years ago.
Yes.
Yes. And that's, the same thing. Our oldest, Rosamund, hates brushing her hair. And it's always a fight. I think we told her we were just going to take her to the barber. I'm just going to confess being a bad parent right now, if you haven't really realized it, but took her to the barber. We were going to have the barber cut all her hair off. Because we said, if you can't take care of your hair, you can't have hair. Oh, that was bad. She lost it. But then she said she had a dream that she lost her hair. and now she'll be like, you have to brush my hair, Daddy. It doesn't always work, but I'm just, you're constantly just like, what's going to get the job done? Mm-hmm. And then all of a sudden you realize you've just created a habit without even realizing it.
Mm. Yeah. It's almost like so much of it is behavioral modification.
It is.
And it almost feels like it's a different category than like cultivating character. Mm-hmm. But it's like, in order for us to function, I need you to do what I'm telling you to do.
Right.
And it's not so that you become a good person. It's so that our family can function tonight.
Yes. So that we can make it through dinner and to bedtime.
Yep.
Yes. I was talking to my brother. He's in the exact same stage of life as me with young kids the other day. And we were talking about dinner time, what you had mentioned, just how hard it is. And we've done some things that have made it a little bit better. We do like rose thorn, and our kids actually like that, and they engage with that. And we've made some games, and talking, getting them engaged with something helps. But it's easy to just devolve into madness that your kid won't eat the food that you just prepared, and it's delicious and it's amazing, and they need to eat or else they're going to ask for a snack an hour later before bed. So you're like, and anger comes up, just eat this food, all this stuff. And I remember saying to my brother, like, I think what I really want out of our dinner time is feelings of happiness. Like, I want to instill positivity around food. I want them to connect eating with positivity. I don't want to create weird relationships with food. And my brother goes, there's nothing positive about trying to get a toddler to eat dinner. He's like, have you ever tried it? And I was like, that's a really good point.
So we have these moments when we realize, as I'm going to use a Dave-ism here. I mean, it's not original to you, but Dave often says you have these moments when you realize the tail is wagging the dog, or that something is kind of reversed. And that's what we're talking about. You have these moments of realization when you discover sort of that you've developed a habit in your household unintentionally. I totally hear you, Michael, with the additional book at bedtime. I don't know why those habits seem to be, if it happens once, then it is forever expected. And yet other habits are very difficult to establish. But we're going to flip this now and say, so we realize sometimes we've developed these rhythms or habits unintentionally. It wasn't something that we went into determining this is how we want bedtime to be. It just sort of came about that it was that way. And yet the power of that habit, of those routines over time becomes so great. And so if we can begin to weave in some healthy rhythms to develop some healthy habits, or ones that we do choose, I guess we could say it that way, then the same is true. Those can be really powerful. And those habits can be a part of how we develop a culture of spiritual formation in our homes. That begins with some of these realizations when we process and assess what rhythms we have, what habits or cultural liturgies we have, what practices we're allowing to just sort of happen over and over. And then begin to say, so then how do we start to choose some of these habits that lead to a certain sort of formation and enable us to create a culture of discipleship in our homes? And that requires this process of thinking, so connecting learning in our minds to these practices, and that is lived out through our bodies in the ways that we exist together. That takes a lot of work because we naturally kind of default to this set of habits that we inherit culturally. So we kind of default to the American set of habits or cultural expectations, or things like screen times, because screens are just ubiquitous in our culture, those sorts of things. So what are some of the things that you've identified? Dave, you mentioned it already in the example about meal times, and that you'd identified a central value that you wanted to preserve, and then changed a habit or a practice to match with that value. So how are you processing this as parents, and how have you begun to go about that in your homes?
Well, I think another example, you guys are mentioning bedtime routines, which of course is the bane of every parent's existence in the evenings, especially with when the kids are so demanding. We had the same dynamic, reading, constantly reading one book to the other. But what became...
Which, to be clear, all of us think you should read to your children.
Yeah. Right. But for us, it became clear that the value there is actually learning.
Yeah.
Like Renee and I want a home that fosters curiosity and learning and the capacity to read and be engrossed in story. Okay, so, but that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to forever be narrating stories, for an hour every evening. Now, we did that for years, but it got to where it was, we needed to change the habit. Me or Renee was falling asleep with one of the kids every night at 7:30 or 8 or whatever time it was. And that just, over the course of time, that just isn't sustainable. So we had to taper that off. But we began to really press in the value of reading, for you to read, and then talking about books that they're reading, and then kind of untangling a little bit the evening routine from the value of reading, curiosity. And I'm not saying that transition was seamless for us. Of course it wasn't. But I think once we identified what it is we wanted, we felt freer from the expectation that we have to do this. Mm-hmm. Because the reason why you feel like you have to do it is because it's connected to that value. Well, how else are they going to learn to love reading? And okay, well, there are other ways you can do that, and also have some time for you and your spouse in the evening, other than just going to sleep with your kids every night. Mm-hmm. So to me, that the process really is identifying where the value is, where's the virtue you want to form in your family, and then it creatively beginning to apply that in ways that actually fit where your family's at. Mm-hmm. And what's so crazy is how quickly your kids grow. Like, I remember hearing this all the time, and it's so trite, but it's so true. The time flies. I know how you see your girls right now, and they're so cute and little. I still see Will that way. Like, that doesn't change. So I feel
You're just
like
making me feel guilty now. I do love and value my kids. I
No.
cherish my time with them. But it's tempting when you're have the young kids. In a lot of what I hear you saying is to think of them as almost like projects. Bedtime's a project that needs to get done.
Yeah.
And here's the formula to complete the project so that I can get the outcome, which is me having time by myself in the evening or time with my wife. And they're people. And when I started, I had a huge conviction around this because I realized I was trying to speed through bedtime as fast as I could, speed through books. I actually started, and I still do this, but skipping pages till she caught me, Rosie.
Yeah, because they have those books memorized.
Yeah.
So they know when
So
you're
skipping
cheating.
words, summarizing, I realized I don't have to read them. I can just make it up and, you know, and getting through as quick as possible so I could get out of there. And then I was reading something and it was basically like, but the point of bedtime is the time together. The point is not to get to something or to get them to sleep. The point of reading to them is being with them and reading, which is what you were saying about the value of learning and
Yes.
education. And so I had to confess my selfishness in it. And now I love that time. And I mean, she's in a better phase of life, so that helps. But I'm laying in bed with my daughter, recognizing someone like you from your standpoint who doesn't get to do that anymore in this way. And just she's vulnerable and safe at the same time. And it's just like, it's one of the sweetest parts of my day now. And so it shifted. And when it shifted in my heart, it shifted in my attitude and even it went better.
Yeah.
So I was also going to ask you, Dave, did you feel like a lot of your habits came out of prepared values, like you just mentioned, or do you feel like the habits you had clarified values for you?
Option B.
Yeah.
Almost all of them were, we're just trying to piece it together.
Yeah.
Right. So you do what you know how to do as a parent with kids. But then in the habit of doing them, you begin to if it's life sucking, then that means it's not connected to a value or something that you love or think is important, but you feel like chained to it because you have to do it in order to survive. So for me, the clarity of values comes in sort of recognizing midway through, is this habit, this thing we're doing, aligned with this or not? Once I had that mindset shift that all of my rhythms are subject to change to align better with what Renee and I feel like is most important, then I think both of us felt a lot of freedom and a lot of, it sparks creative thinking. How can we sort of make our household more life-giving? And then suddenly things we know we have to do, like taking our kids to school, it's another kind of shift in our mind like that. And I know because of work situations, not everyone's able to do this, but nevertheless, just for our family, going to school and taking the kids to school wasn't just a job to get done. This is time with my kid. And so how do I maximize this time together? And that walk to elementary school and back, so that it's no longer just a task, but it's actually aligned with values. Again, I know many of us don't have that kind of power over our schedule, but for us, aligning that task to a value was really important. And it still is important today. It was a decision we made a long time ago, and that's still a core habit where taking the kids to school is not a project. It's not a task. It's time I get to spend with my kids. And I count it as that, and I view it as that. And I still see it, even though my kids are in middle school and high school. That's still important time for me.
That's really good. I was just going to say, and kind of goes off what you're saying, but for us, I think that so much of the toddler phase is just task oriented. And so it almost can feel at a certain point like your schedule is actually not even in your control. Your habits are just what needs to get done. It takes forever to get them dressed and get their shoes on, and and I have good kids, like and get them fed, and like so at a certain point we can't start Jillian and I can't start from like, what do we want to do with the kids? Well, everything we have to do is more important. So then the question becomes, what can we do within the habits that are already established to do discipleship, to teach them about Jesus, to find moments like taking to school, things like that, to build in recreation and fun in a way that is good for them and points them to Jesus. And I mean, we've been talking about bedtime a lot. So even on that, like, we were in a tough phase where with prayer, and I've always heard like, pray for your kids before bed. That's a really good time for prayer. Well, my daughter really didn't want to. It was really hard. She still has a really hard time praying. She doesn't really like to pray. So I was like, well, this habit's not working. And so I read, I think it was the Habits of the Household guy. What's his name?
Justin Whitmel Early.
Justin Early. He put out some bedtime prayers, and one of them was a tickle prayer. And basically you thank God for the gift of joy and laughter, and then you kind of just out of nowhere attack your kid with tickles. and then you have them say like, thank you, God, and it's really sweet. And so I built it up and I surprised Rosie. I said, I have a new prayer, a really special prayer. It's silly. It's a silly prayer. Do you want to know what it is? She was like, yeah. And then I did it. She died laughing, and she asked for it every day for the next week. Dad, can we do the silly prayer tonight? And eventually, I had to be like, silly prayer is not for every night, but there's other prayers we can try. And so just breaking that habit that I was in that wasn't working, finding something new, and then just building off of that was just one way. And I think we try to do that with just a lot of different areas of our life.
I think we've identified a few aspects of this here. So within my question about spiritual formation and the power of habit, and how we begin to identify things that, as you just said, Michael, aren't working, or perhaps we just don't want them to exist in that way. It's not a healthy rhythm. And then to invert that and say, how do we develop habits? So similarly, patterns that we can repeat and fall into that do actually help us preserve these values that we identify. And that often happens along the way, as Dave was saying. This isn't a project, it is a growth together. And one of the things that I think, as I've listened to both of you share about your families, one of those is a perspective shift and an attachment to the theological principle of God as our Father, his long-suffering nature towards us. And Michael, you actually spoke about this very thing, I think in a sermon from Mark, in the way that taking care of children, especially when they're little, especially when they are very dependent, and how God attaches that to his care for us and the way that we exist within his kingdom. So part of this is a perspective shift. When we're caught in a certain season of parenting or of family life, it can be so easy to feel penned in by that season and just sort of at the behest of this 2-year-old or this 7-year-old. But often reminding ourselves of those bigger theological truths, and then the fact that this is a time-bound season, that, as you're saying, Dave, it will pass. And yet that the time that was within that time-bound season is still such an opportunity for us. So if we assess, shift our perspective, and then determine where maybe some of those habits aren't serving us well, and ask what we can replace them with. Or, as you're saying, Dave, ask where those habits exist, like traveling to school every day. And then ask how we can actually attach one of those values, infuse that time with one of those virtues or values. I think of an example in our household that's one that I have to work hard at doing. In the evenings when I get home from work, and now my kids are old enough to be off doing their own things often. Sometimes Ivy, my littlest, still wants a lot of attention and says mom very frequently. So that does still happen. But one of the patterns that we've attempted to establish in our house is that one of them helps me make dinner on one night of the week. So like Mondays is Ivy's night, Tuesday is Axel's night, Wednesday is Aspen's night. And the value in that is time spent together, but also this aspect kind of knowledge transfer or like doing something, participating in an activity together that's then providing something for everyone else in our family. So the value in it is this sharing in life and being able to share a part of knowledge that is in the doing of it together. And it gives us a chance to talk about their day.
Wait, so do your kids, do they view this as like, oh, today's my day, I get to do dinner? Or do they view it as like, oh, my responsibility is dinner today? It's like, is it chore or is it like gift?
I think it's somewhere in between. So I think their default would be that they just want to do whatever they want to do with their time. But then once we begin it and get into it, then we always have a great time doing it together.
Because both my kids want to help out with everything in every meal all the time. So I'm like trying to embrace that. And I gave Clementine some potatoes to cut. We have a training knife last night, and she couldn't cut a potato, in case you wanted to know. But, so it's just like, it's just so different. It's really helpful to hear.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, no, they all would, especially my older kiddos. Ivy will be around perpetually, but my older kids would be off doing their own thing. And so the barrier is just the initiation point. Pull them away from whatever it is that they're doing with their time and ask them to come. But then once we settle into it, we always really enjoy it.
That's awesome. We've just started this semester, since Renee and I are in a new fellowship group, meets on Wednesday nights, and our boys are home doing their own thing, but they have to eat. So Will,
Do they? 3 teenage boys?
yeah. So, but Will's on the hook for making dinner for his brothers every Wednesday.
Wow.
And that's been sort of a paradigm shift. It is hearing you, I'm inspired by the partnership, how you're describing it, Autumn. Ours isn't, Renee sets him up for success, but it's us literally gone and just trusting that he does it. And we just get the report afterward, how good the food was or not. Usually
Renee's
it's pretty
like
good.
giving him one of those HelloFresh boxes. She's pre-chopped everything. She's like, the ingredient list is
he
pre-measured.
does. He gets all the ingredients out and chops and does everything. But there is, you mentioned the knowledge transfer. I feel like that's an interesting part of parenting that's kind of old school. That trade kind of,
Apprenticeship.
Apprenticeship. I love that and connected to cooking. I'm not a very good cook. Renee's awesome, and so she kind of has the ability to do that in a way that I can't. But it's cool to hear that.
Where did you guys start with this, Dave? Like, did you bring intentionality into your like young parenting phase, or did it grow over time with habits?
I would say we had high level pictures, visions of kind of what we wanted our family to look like and feel like, and then we're just sort of in survival mode. Kind of, it was pretty a general picture. I want a family that looks like this, and it wasn't super clear. Like we never like reverse engineered it specifically, but then in critical moments made these mindset shifts to be in more alignment with this vision of family that we wanted. There are rhythms we have established over the years, annual rhythms of planning of, is our life actually in alignment or in the direction where God wants it to be, that we can have just enough space to evaluate some of those habits that are just sort of default. But those times came later. They came later. I would say in the last 5 or 6 years, those times came.
Dave, you mentioned that annual planning process. That's something that I think we didn't start when our kids were young either. I don't know if I would have, thinking back to that time, I don't know if I would have thought at the time that I had the mental capacity to be able to do that, to plan out a year at a time. I would encourage parents who have young children to do that now. It isn't a practice that I did at that time. So that's one regular rhythm that your family maintains now. What are some daily or weekly rhythms, if you were to kind of bullet point those, what do you try to do routinely with your family on a daily or weekly basis?
Probably the most important time, Renee and I take Friday off. The kids are in school, so we have a day together on Friday. And that time is really important just for us and our own marriage. Our stability as a family really is leans on the health of our marriage. So to the extent that we're connected and enjoying being around each other, it's like oil in an engine. Like everything else sort of works better if Renee and I are connected. So I think that time is, and that's weekly, it's every Friday. And that's really critical for the well-being of our family. I would say another rhythm is church. Like, even though our family life with church is weird because I'm a pastor and it's a work day for me, it's still important for us as a family rhythm. Like, even though all the things that go along with being a part of a pastor's family, them worshiping, sitting in church together, taking communion, being under God's word, like, it's not complicated. It's critical for our family as a rhythm, and we feel it. If for whatever reason they're not able to come or we're out of town or whatever, we don't have that rhythm, man, it, like, the expiration date on us suddenly becomes a lot sooner than what we expected. Like, we need that time.
I could not agree more. I was even just thinking about this. Church came to my mind because, well, as far as just being a Christian, an ordinary Christian, there are built-in habits that are just set, that are traditional, historical Christianity. One of them is the weekly habit of going to a church service. And there's nothing else in our culture, like, at least where we live in Denver, that's like that.
Yeah.
That's like, we all go to one place and sing and hear messages, and for my kids to go learn Bible stories, and so it's just built in. And it's so sweet. It's such a gift to have it and to commit to it and to know it's going to be there no matter what. I think there's been some knock in some good ways against just going to church won't disciple your family, won't make you guys a Christian family. You need more engagement. It needs to be in the household. We're going to talk more about that. But now the culture shifted so far away from the reality of people's lives going to church that it actually plays a really central role of just going. And my girls love church. And credit to the children's ministry here. They love their classes.
Yeah, Rosie loves me.
Rosie loves you. She loves all of you. She hugs everyone. She runs up and gives Hunter a huge hug. Like, it's the sweetest thing in the world to see. And Clementine does this too. And people tell me every week about how much they love my kids hugging them and laughing with them. And it's just built in as a gift. And then there's other rhythms built in. I mean, good, faithful discipleship in our lives is a daily habit of reading and prayer. That's built in into my life. Not everybody always has good seasons where they're doing that. But right now I'm enjoying a really sweet season of that in my own life. And my girls are asking me about it because they see it in the morning. They come down, I'm reading, I'm praying. What are you doing, Daddy? I said, I'm communing with God. I'm talking to God. I'm having fellowship with God. And so there's this like, would you sit with me for a little bit? Here's your Jesus Storybook Bible. Let's read. Let's have you spend time with God. It's already there. And I'm not doing anything different than really what I think is just good for the average Christian, And so I think our faith gives us categories that naturally integrate into the home and into our families that really help them see and know God in meaningful ways.
Do you have any weekly rhythms in your family right now, Michael?
Yeah, we have a couple that are newer to our family that we've done better or worse at times, but we really wanted, so I think when it comes to starting habits, there's like two things. One is to go like, this isn't working. We need to do something different, right? We've talked about that with things like bedtime and dinner time. And another thing is to just start integrating meaning into the stuff that's already happening. Mm-hmm. So if something's not working, how do we make it work? Well, there is a time to go, let's do something new, and you just have to do it. Let's try something new and let's start it. And so we wanted to do a family worship night. and what that would look like with our kids. And so we said, let's go every Friday. We're going to do a family worship night. We're going to pray. We're going to sing. We sing the doxology. My kids know it. They love it. They sing it around the house now. We're going to do a lesson, either an interactive lesson with an object lesson and a game and make it fun. Right now, we're just reading through a book. We do a chapter at a time. It's not the Jesus Storybook Bible, but it's one like that. And then we pray. And then my kids say, now can we watch a movie? Because then we do movie night. And so this is, again, like, who's really discipling who here? Because sometimes they'll say, is it family worship night tonight? And I'll say, yeah. And they'll go, what are we watching? So I have to remind them, like, it's a celebration. The movie is something they love and it celebrates. But the point is that we're together, sitting on a couch, engaging the Lord. Now, that's going to shift as they get older, as we go through different seasons of life. But we want to establish the rhythm right now. And then that kicks off our Sabbath. So we do that Friday night, and then we try to engage a 24-hour family Sabbath from Friday into Saturday, where I don't work is the main thing. Our primary goal in that time is not household work orientation. It's what are we doing together as a family, honoring and celebrating one another and God. So those two things have been like, we had to say, like, we have to do this. There's intentionality. This is what it's going to look like. Here's our plan. We have to keep to it. You know, it's not as natural, but it's been really good and really sweet for us.
On occasion, there's something that already exists in your life that you can also say, I'm going to weave meaning or some observation into this. Dave gave the example of going to school. I think also of the example of in our family, we do eat dinner together most nights with different seasons and different kids' activities. That looks a little bit different. But most nights of the week, we eat dinner together. And we do talk about our day and ask a fun or silly question and talk about highs and lows. And one of our pastors, Andy, in a sermon a while ago, suggested that if you have a time like that already, that you can attach some sort of practice. He suggested a gratitude practice. So paying attention to where God is at work during your day, or paying attention to something God has given you, and then just calling that out with your kids in the evening. So you can take a rhythm that already exists and then use it to pay attention to something like that, like spending time intentionally together, or asking a thoughtful question, or making that time purposeful and meaningful, even if it is in really small increments. That only takes an adjustment of a couple of minutes, but it's developing some common language and routine and rhythm for your children around that. So that's one daily habit that we have tried to shift. We thought, that's a really good idea, Andy. And we already do this at dinner.
We started doing that too. We just changed rows because of Andy to what are you thankful for that God has given you. So we just changed it. We should do that for Thorn too, because they're both things to give thanks for. And you're absolutely right. And this is we've talked about Deuteronomy 6 so many times before. This is the model. As you are going, when you're putting your kids to sleep, when you're walking by the way, when you're taking them to school, you're integrating faith. You're not like brand new thing going to start now. But the intentionality of, I'm going to talk about God as frequently and often as I talk about anything in my life, so that my kids are just naturally picking up like the fragrance of God in their life. And so that takes thought and intentionality. But I look for every single opportunity throughout the day just to bring up and point them to the reality of God in their life.
And then that begins to function. I used that term earlier in our conversation, cultural liturgy, which is something we inherit, that we just do. We don't even necessarily think about it as we go about our day. It could be your morning stop for coffee. That could be a part of your cultural liturgy. And then something like this can become a family liturgy, a rhythm, a time at dinner when you think about your day and you think about the gifts God has given you, and you just call those out. It can be as simple as one thing each for each member of your family. That can become a family liturgy, a really powerful habit. Or Dave, you mentioned your time with Renee on Fridays. That's one of your current family liturgies, a pattern, a repeatable pattern that infuses life and meaning into your existence as a family together. All of this functions kind of like creating, we use this other metaphor, a trellis, a framework. When you create these repeatable patterns, they create a framework for your family on which the sort of organic matter, your seasons of life, your kids as they grow and change, can grow and function. And sometimes that trellis, sometimes the actual rhythms and patterns and habits need to shift too in order to sustain a new season of life. But when we put some effort into assessing and developing these rhythms, these habits, then it enables our children to grow and our family to grow together in the right way, in a supported, thoughtful way.
Autumn, that point reminds me of intentionally limiting your bandwidth. One thing, when our kids got older, I know you're in the middle of this too, the expectation on parents and on kids as they get older is to be involved in everything all the time. And it's not just kids, professionally as well. There's no lack of conferences in this world. There's no lack of opportunities to go and be better at what it is that we do professionally as well. Like, there's always opportunities. And if you if your default is to say yes to that all the time, then you actually it takes away opportunities to say yes to the most important things that pop up that do actually align more closely with what you think is your most important values. And I've found that trellis metaphor to be so helpful because a lot of good things might pop up that just don't deserve to be in my life because it does, not because it's not good, because I need to create some space for that truly organic matter to come up. Otherwise, it's just going to get filled with a lot of stuff that's not really fruit. And I always have to be careful in my own life and help other people to keep schedule audits, regular schedule audits. And is my actual week filled up with stuff that's in alignment with what's most important? Or am I doing a lot of good things that actually prevent me from doing the most important things? And a recent kind of example of this kind of popped up where Wednesday afternoons, I generally, it's kind of half day for the kids, and I just make it a point not to schedule anything Wednesday afternoon as much as I can help it. And you guys know that I'm obsessed with basketball, and Beckett is too. And an opportunity popped up they needed a middle school boys B team basketball coach, head basketball coach.
B team.
JV.
Sorry, JV.
And within 30 minutes of that being posted, two people very close to me, one being my wife and the other being the executive pastor of this church, Fred, forwarded that email to me, both with saying, essentially, this obviously is something you have to do. Now, there have been lots of quote-unquote opportunities to fill up my Wednesdays. But I've said no to them, and I've just kept that space open. But then when this came along, it was in such alignment with values, and passions, and calling, and time with Beckett. It was an obvious yes. But it would never have happened if I hadn't had enough bandwidth to say yes to it. So I just want to also encourage people, kind of the negative side of all of this is saying no to good things out there and opportunities out there that will inevitably crowd out the most important time and resources you need to dedicate towards your family and building that structure that creates and fosters health.
It's a really, really good word. That I definitely see that and feel that burden. We're not really giving our kids the childhood they deserve if they're not in all of these things and constantly doing. And the thing that they need the most is us as their parents, is time with us. And those things are competing for that. And so it should should not be taken lightly. Responsibilities of that sort should be thoughtful and prayerful. And yeah, I think it's a good word.
And there's cost with it, of course, and discernment is necessary.
Right.
In that, what to say yes and what to say no to. But on the whole, only saying yes to the most important things is, I think, a good rule of thumb.
An assumption that all of us share and that we're carrying into this conversation is that we as parents and the parents we're speaking to, we all desire good things for our kids. We all desire for our kids to grow up, to be healthy, to be educated, to be functional, that these are desires that we as parents carry into this process. And then those desires meet the reality of like having a 2 and 4-year-old and existing in this space where you feel like you're trying to make it through each day. And so bringing these values that are hopefully shaped by the gospel, that's our hope for us and for all of us, bringing these desires as parents into alignment with this day-to-day lived reality that God has given us. That lived reality, the way we show up in the mornings, the way our children come and find us when you're reading in the morning, Michael, or that you get to coach Beckett's basketball team, Dave, these realities are
We won
gifts.
last night, by the way. I know you're all wondering.
Wonderful.
Oh, congrats.
We're celebrating
We're
with
undefeated.
You know, when you win, it's good job, coach. And when you lose, it's definitely the players.
Absolutely. I believe that to be true.
It's called the Nathaniel Hackett.
And so these questions, we're just going to keep moving.
Sorry, Autumn.
It's called the Nathaniel Hackett. These questions that we're asking about our time and the way that we exist together as a family and the way we steward the lives of our children. The questions we're asking are because the primary stuff of life is just in these day-to-day realities with our families. And so you had mentioned before, Michael, the significance of parents. And as you and I have talked about kids ministry and student fellowship, we've looked at a bunch of different research about how to do this. If Christian parents desire to follow Jesus, to provide homes for their children that are stable and loving, that set them up well for life in the future, and desire to help them know Jesus, then what does this look like? How do we actually go about this process, this project? In a sense, we just said our kids aren't a project. I just said project, but this life project, the sharing of life with our kids and families. And so in our discussions of how we personally do that, and then how we talk about this as a church family and as ministry leaders, we've identified the necessity of parents in the lives of their children. We see that in the lives of our kids. We see that in the lives of so many kids who we love who are a part of our church family. And so we identify one central aspect of family ministry at Fellowship Denver as discipleship at home, or we sometimes use the language gospel renewal at home. There is a real order to the way that we talk about this. Parents first have to be renewed by the gospel. So those rhythms, assessing your time, spending time with God daily, spending time with your spouse, those rhythms are necessary also for the health of your home. And that's the first order here in establishing these rhythms. That's first in order, is asking, how are you personally being renewed by the gospel? And then you begin to assess, how do I share life? How do I share what I'm learning and what I'm experiencing with my children, with my family? And then provide a space in which your children can be formed by the gospel.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is me talking really more as from, I mean, we've been talking as like parents, and this is what we do. And I hope we've brought some level of like humanity. Like my kids are not just singing
reality
hymns all the time because I work for a church, you know, like I struggle with the same stuff as everyone else. But, you know, I'm a youth minister, and speaking as a youth minister, I believe in discipleship in the church. I believe we create avenues of discipleship for teenagers to grow up. And I believe in children's ministry. But we know, because of research and because of theology, biblical theology, without a shadow of a doubt, parents are the most important influence on their kids' lives when it comes to matters of faith. Christian Smith is a sociologist, Harvard grad, very smart researcher. He's written extensively about this. He wrote a good little article recently called Keeping the Faith. He said this, according to his research: the good news is that among all possible influences, parents exert far and away the greatest influence on their children's religious outcomes. Stated differently, the bad news is that nearly all human responsibility for the religious trajectory of children's lives falls on their parents' shoulders. The empirical evidence is clear. In almost every case, no other institution or program comes close to shaping youth religiously as their parents do. Not religious congregations, youth groups, faith-based schools, missions and service trips, summer camps, Sunday school, youth ministers, or anything else. Those influences can reinforce the influence of parents, but almost never do they surpass or override it. What makes every other influence pale into virtual insignificance is the importance, or not, of the religious beliefs and practices of American parents in their ordinary lives, not only on holy days, but every day throughout weeks and years. That is sobering and filled with so much hope if you're a parent. Mm-hmm. If you are afraid, who's going to influence my kid? What can I do to help them know Jesus when everything else in the world is basically not? Then there's great hope in that when you're renewed by the gospel and you invite your kids into ordinary faith, everyday faith integrated into your life, that's the number one most shaping influence possible on their life if you want them to come to know and follow Jesus for the rest of their life. So I feel that weight on myself, holy moly. And I'm like, oh, what a beautiful responsibility God's called me to.
Michael, how do you sort of deal with that weight? I remember us talking about this when our oldest was becoming teenager, and I was like, well, thank God we have Michael. And
I was like, don't you dare put that evil on me.
I was like, okay, Will's good. I'm just going to hand him right off to Michael, and you kind of shape him. And you come back at me with this Christian Smith business. And it's like, I've got a lot of pastoral stuff. Do I have to pastor, shepherd my kids as well? And you are like, yeah. So it is a ton of it. How does the reality, I have been shaped and influenced by this truth and you helping me through it over the years. How do I deal with that and also lean into the community? I'm glad my kids have a great youth pastor. I'm glad they have other adults who are invested in their life. And I know that sort of the authentic or inauthentic relationship I have with God, my relationship with God to the extent that it's true is going to influence my kid. I just see parents at home going, how do I deal with the reality of that weight and still lean into community? Because I can't bear it all.
Right.
You
have to feel the sharp. You have to feel the sharpness of it. You have to feel the weight of it. You already feel this. I already feel this as a parent. I feel the responsibility for my kids to live. So I already feel this growing sense. So then you just add the spiritual component to it too, while also you cannot guarantee your kids will follow Jesus. You cannot guarantee that they will love and follow Jesus and be Christians. You do not wear that. You can do everything in your power. We know the research. We know it works. You do everything in your power. But God works in your kids' lives, and they're responsible for themselves at a certain point as well. So I think that's comforting. The other thing that's comforting is that you don't have to do anything. I think a lot of parents feel ill-equipped. I don't know how to teach them theology. I don't know how to talk about these things. And it's what he's actually talking about is what you need to do. And this is a call to action. You need to pursue a relationship with Jesus Christ in a real way as a parent. You need to love God. You need to worship God. You need to read scripture and go to church. And ordinary Christianity, you're inviting your kids into that. So it's just a call to be a Christian in a really real way.
There's a part of what you said too, Dave, that I think exists really beautifully here at Fellowship, because we do have a wonderful student fellowship ministry.
Yes. Which I believe in, obviously.
But I have a real-time example. My oldest daughter, her first year in high school was tough for a number of reasons. And in the middle of some really hard questions that she was asking about herself, about life, of us, Michael and I were working on a series to teach, a sexuality series to walk our parents through. And then Michael and the student fellowship team were preparing material to teach to our kids. And so some of those questions about sexuality, about gender identity, were exactly what we were talking about in our home. And yet our role in those moments was to have those conversations, but also to just be really lovingly present every day in the hard stuff, in the good stuff, in sharing life, in still having family dinners, in doing roses and thorns, in maintaining all those rhythms. And then because we're a part of a bigger community and there are other people present in our kids' lives who care for them and who actually have input into their lives. Some of them are, for our oldest, for Aspen, her student fellowship leaders. Then tracking through some very specific theologically grounded teaching was extremely meaningful for her, for our family in that time, for her to be able to hear those things from someone else who was involved in her life, who loved her, who she trusts. That was an aspect of community that we needed then during what was a time when we thought, we're not sure what the formula is here. We're not sure like what it means. What is our call as parents right now? Well, we know it's to love. We know it's to be present. And we know it's to talk and offer insight where we can. But the reality of community around us allowed us to say that there were also other people who she could interact with and hear these things
Yeah,
from.
and we are a resource to come alongside parents to help reinforce what they hope to do with their kids. We don't replace them, but that's a very powerful resource to come alongside parents.
So to your question, Dave, yes, parents, feel the weight of it, and know that within your local church community, definitely here at Fellowship, but within your local church community, there are people around you who desire to love your kids and walk with you through this too, so that you don't feel all that weight on your own. All right, let's send our listeners out today with a few specific, really practical questions. So based on our conversation, the content we've worked through, I think first, whatever stage of life you're in, with whatever age kids you have at home, ask first, what are the habits or rhythms or patterns that exist in our family life right now? And are those the habits, rhythms, and patterns that are serving us well? Or are they habits and patterns that we've just fallen into? Maybe because culture has given them to us, maybe because they just work and enable us to exist together. That's important. And then ask, are any of those habits or patterns or rhythms a space where I could actually redeem that time in a sense, where I could attach a practice or a mindset or shift my perspective such that I could use an existing rhythm to spend intentional time with my kids or to develop some shared language in those moments, like going to school, like when you're sitting at dinner, or, as Dave said, at breakfast, whatever time that might be. And then ask, are there any intentional habits or practices that I personally need or want to start in my life as a parent or in our shared life together as a family? All right. Well, we'll wrap it up with that. We'll leave you with those questions. Dave, Michael, thanks for spending time on the podcast with me today.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Autumn.
If you have questions about today's episode or suggestions about what you'd like to hear us discuss on the podcast in the future, you can send all of that anytime to podcast@fellowshipdenver.org. Thanks for joining us on the Vision for Life podcast. Special thanks to Adam Englund for our theme music, to Jesse Cowan, our producer, and to Judd Connell, who provides transcription for these episodes.